Can a single sentence mark the beginning of the divorce between Lewis Hamilton and Ferrari? What is behind that desperate radio message in Qatar? Today I reveal to you the whole truth about Ferrari's technical, strategic, and emotional collapse, and why Hamilton might not stay silent for long. The phrase that exploded in Qatar, that famous "man, the car won't go any quicker," was not born at that time. It was the final result of an erosion process that had been brewing for weeks. It was the dull cry of a pilot who had won everything, and who now found himself prisoner of a structure with no present ambition. It was, in short, the surrender of a warrior without weapons, but with full awareness that something is broken at Ferrari, and maybe can't be fixed. The Qatar Grand Prix wasn't just a bad weekend for Ferrari. It was the crudest and most public demonstration of the collapse of a technical project that had already lost its way months before. What happened in Lusail was much more than a poor performance on the track. It was a global exhibition of the internal fractures, design errors, and lack of direction that have been dragging on since pre-season. The debacle began before Hamilton even left the garage. After 2 days of inconsistent data, Ferrari made the desperate decision to radically modify the SF25's configuration based almost entirely on simulations. They were not conventional adjustments, they were last-minute structural changes that sought to compensate for deep deficiencies in the chassis. That decision, although understandable from internal panic, meant one thing: Ferrari no longer knew how to interpret its own car. That's why Hamilton was forced to start the sprint race from the pit lane. The car he received when leaving the box was not an evolution of the one he had driven before, but practically another vehicle, assembled under an experimental logic in the face of the inability to find real solutions. The result was worse than expected. Hamilton wasn't just relegated to the background. The car seemed incapable of responding to any attempt to extract performance. The loss of stability was so pronounced that it was evident even from the onboard cameras. The SF25 moved nervously on a straight line, and in medium curves it required constant corrections, a clear symptom of an aerodynamic platform that does not work linearly. Meanwhile, on the other side of the garage, Charles Leclerc was suffering from a completely different but equally destructive phenomenon. The Monégasque reported a sensation of total emptiness in the front of the car, describing it as an absolute absence of grip. His subsequent statements summed it up with a devastating phrase: the car had zero performance, and the only real hope was for a safety car to fall from the sky to generate artificial opportunities. When a Ferrari driver publicly admits that he depends on chance, it means that he no longer trusts the engineering, the strategy, or the team's work plan. But the most serious thing is what the subsequent data revealed. Telemetry analyses confirmed irregular behavior that engineers could not predict. The SF25 suffered what they internally called phantom downforce loss. This phenomenon appeared intermittently in high-speed curves, where the floor of the car, due to design or structural fatigue, experienced microdeformations that altered airflow. This alteration caused turbulence that completely destabilized the balance between the front and rear axle. For Ferrari, this was an absolute disaster because it meant that even the wind tunnel and CFD measurements did not match the actual on-track performance .in figures. This translated into an average loss of 7 km per hour in the fast sequences of the circuit. 7 km per hour that could not be recovered on a straight line or compensated for with any configuration. Hamilton described it with surgical precision. The car has no stability, the rear axle is not planted, it slides when it shouldn't, it grips when it doesn't have to, and to make matters worse, the rebound appears at the entrance to curves like turn 10, generating vibrations that break any attempt to draw with confidence. That mixture of understeer in the middle of the corner, sudden oversteer at the exit, and bounce when changing support is the worst possible combination for a driver. Not only does it make the car slow, it makes it unpredictable. And in Formula One, an unpredictable car is a car that cannot be worked on or corrected in a weekend. That is why Qatar became the epicenter of shame, because it made it clear that there were no real tools to rescue the performance of the SF25. For Hamilton, the feeling of helplessness was total. For the first time since his arrival at Ferrari, his radio communications sounded resigned, not angry. In one sentence, he summed up the tragedy of Qatar, and perhaps of the entire season: the car cannot go faster. That message, far from being a complaint, was a diagnostic statement. Ferrari had pushed the SF25 to the limit, and that limit was dramatically low. By the end of the weekend, Ferrari could no longer hide the obvious. It wasn't a tire problem, it wasn't a setup problem, it wasn't even a driver adaptation problem. It was a profound conceptual error in the architecture of the car. A design that was born limited, that was not developed, and that upon reaching a circuit with extreme lateral loads like Lusail, simply collapsed. Qatar was much more than a bad result. It was a mirror. And what Ferrari saw reflected in that mirror was so uncomfortable that Hamilton's message remained the only undeniable truth of the weekend. There was no way to go faster because Ferrari simply had nothing more to offer with the SF25. In Formula One, public radios are not only communication tools between driver and engineer. They are also carefully calculated messages that can have multiple recipients, from the mechanics in the pit to the international press, the sponsors, and even the managers watching from the offices in Maranello. Therefore, when Lewis Hamilton said in Qatar that lapidary man, the car won't go any quicker, he was not simply describing a slow car. He was raising a claim with much deeper implications. That message was a breaking point, a symbolic act. A driver of his caliber, with 7 world championships, knows perfectly well when his words are just frustration and when they are a controlled bomb. What we heard on the radio was surgical criticism disguised as resignation. And its objective was clear: to publicly expose what Ferrari refuses to admit internally. To understand the magnitude of these words, we must take into account the institutional context. At Ferrari, the corporate culture is extremely hierarchical and traditional. Open criticism is not tolerated well, and the Scuderia's public image is treated with an almost ceremonial obsession. Any sign of an internal crisis is usually handled indoors. But Hamilton decided to break that code. He spoke from a track in real time and made it clear that the car was not limited by a bad session, but by its own technical conception. What Hamilton really communicated was that the SF25 project had failed, that the car had no room for development, that the team had reached a technical dead end, and that any further effort would be a waste of time if the structure did not react immediately. It is a message that exposed the lack of leadership, the disconnection between engineering and management, and the helplessness of a team that had thrown the season away before even reaching the halfway point of the calendar. But that message was also a silent warning. Hamilton is not willing to burn the last years of his career waiting for a miracle. His signing for Ferrari was not a romantic gesture. It was a strategic bet for one last championship, for a legacy. And if the current structure of the Scuderia is not up to that ambition, the Briton will do everything necessary to make it clear, including using his public influence to put pressure where it hurts most on Ferrari's reputation as an elite team. But there is something even more worrying. These types of statements, made in public by a driver of Hamilton's stature, often have long-lasting side effects. They weaken internal cohesion. They generate divisions within the technical team. They fuel rumors in the press. And above all, they make rivals smell blood. In a championship as tight as 2025, the perception of crisis at Ferrari can have immediate sporting consequences: extra pressure on Leclerc, doubts in strategic decisions, and an entire team operating under constant tension. That's why Hamilton's message was not just criticism. It was a desperate act of leadership, a last attempt to wake up a structure that seems anesthetized in the face of disaster. And also, perhaps, a first step towards something more: the construction of a narrative that will free him, when the time comes, from a relationship that is already beginning to show signs of premature wear. Qatar was the point where the message became inevitable. What comes next will depend on whether Ferrari reacts or simply continues in free fall. But one thing is now certain: the message was sent. And everyone inside and outside the paddock heard it. The Qatar Grand Prix was not just a failed race for Ferrari. It was a painfully accurate X-ray of a team that is falling apart from the inside, and of a driver who is beginning to look to the future with increasing doubts. What Lewis Hamilton left in the air with a single phrase on the radio does not need interpretation, is not a complaint, it is a clinical diagnosis. The car can't go faster, and for now, neither does Ferrari. Let me know in the comments what you think about all this.